At my sister-in-law's wedding rehearsal dinner, I arrived to find no place setting for me. Juliette, my husband's viciously flawless sister, smirked from the head table. "Oh darling," she purred. "We only reserved seats for important guests." The groom's aristocratic family tittered. My husband Graham merely shrugged. "Don't make a scene, Evelyn." I didn't. I excused myself to freshen up and set the timer on Juliette's downfall. I knew it was coming. The moment her champagne glass clinked against the baccarat chandelier, the entire dining hall fell silent, just as she'd orchestrated. "A toast," she announced. Her voice coded in false warmth that fooled everyone, except those who truly knew her. I tightened my grip on my champagne flute, the stem nearly cracking between my fingers. My husband remained oblivious, his attention caught by some hedge fund joke across the room. Russell Sterling stood proudly at the center of the Lumiere ball he'd organized, months of work culminating in this charity gala for pediatric cancer research. At 66 he carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who'd built his empire from the ground up, unlike my father-in-law Charles Whitmore Sr., who had inherited his fortune and expanded it through cronyism, not creativity. To Russell, Juliette continued, crimson lips curling into what others might mistake for a smile. "I knew better, for bringing us all together tonight." She paused, letting the crowd murmur in approval. "Before we begin," she added smoothly, "I want to thank each of you for being part of this incredible journey. If you're enjoying these tales of revenge and social reckoning, consider subscribing. It's completely free and supports more stories about people who refuse to stay silent in the face of cruelty." Now let's watch as Evelyn sets the timer on her sister-in-law's downfall. The crowd chuckled politely. The annual Lumiere Ball marked the pinnacle of New York society, a place where fortunes rose and reputations shattered between dessert and digestive. Though Juliette added, her voice dipping into a theatrical stage whisper that somehow echoed across the marble, "The lighting is especially kind to you tonight. Russell, almost hides that gleaming dome of yours." Nervous laughter tiptoed through the guests. "What did they call you in that Tribeca Tribune profile last month? The bald eagle of business?" She laughed lightly, twirling a strand of her expensively balayaged hair. "I always thought vulture more accurate, given how you hovered over the Lydian merger." The laughter stopped. Several investors in the Lydian deal stood nearby. Russell's acquisition had been polarizing, ruthless, but entirely legal. I watched Charles's face pale as Juliette continued her social assault, obliterating in seconds a business alliance he'd nurtured for years. "Juliette," I hissed, stepping toward her, "that's enough." She ignored me, as always. Graham's forgettable wife. The scholarship girl who'd married into money but would never truly belong. "To our bald vulture," she finished, raising her glass higher, "may your talons never lose their grip." Silence crashed across the room like a physical blow. I met Russell's eyes across the space, the steel there unmistakable, cold, calculating, and suddenly very, very dangerous. This wasn't just a social blunder, it was business suicide. Charles finally moved, crossing the room with remarkable speed for a man his size. "My apologies, Russell," he said loudly, gripping Juliette's elbow with barely disguised fury. "My daughter's sense of humor sometimes exceeds her sense of propriety." She meant no disrespect. "Of course not," Juliette agreed smoothly, though her eyes told a different story. She'd meant every word, a petty, calculated jab at Russell for turning down her pitch to lead the Sterling Foundation's marketing division last month. Juliette never handled rejection well. "No offense taken," Russell replied, his voice glacial. "Though I'd be cautious with the bird of prey metaphors, Miss Whitmore. Even vultures serve a purpose in nature's hierarchy." The orchestra struck up again, desperately attempting to paper over the tension. Graham finally appeared at my side, squeezing my hand while entirely missing the tension that crackled through the air. "Everything okay?" he asked, cheerful and oblivious. "Fine," I lied, watching as Charles forced Juliette to approach Russell directly. Her apology was a masterclass in insincerity. "I'm terribly sorry if my toast came across as inappropriate, Russell. You know how much I adore your unique profile." Russell's nod was so stiff it might have cracked something. "Of course, Juliette. Your candor has always been your most distinctive trait." That should have ended it. A social faux pas swept under the rug with a well-practiced smile. But I'd spent enough time studying the interplay between these powerful families to recognize the tremor that had just rippled beneath the surface of their carefully constructed alliance. "He'll never forgive her," a voice murmured at my elbow. I turned to find Claire Sterling, Russell's daughter, and surprisingly my closest ally in this world of designer smiles and silent knives. Unlike the other trust fund heirs, Claire had started in the mailroom of Sterling Capital and worked her way up. "Your father's always been gracious," I said diplomatically, In public, yes, Claire snorted, steering me toward the terrace doors. But did you see his eyes? Outside, the summer night wrapped around us like velvet. The city skyline glittered below, the Sterling Tower's spire cutting into the sky like a blade. Dad's been looking for an exit from your in-laws for months, she confided, voice low. This merger Charles keeps bragging about with Aldridge Maritime, it's built on sand. The only reason Dad hasn't pulled the plug is the legacy between our families. I absorbed her words silently, tucking them away like a loaded weapon. For 3 years I'd endured Juliette's calculated cruelty, her passive-aggressive her constant reminders that I was the scholarship girl who married into the Whitmore name, but would never truly be one of them. Don't repeat that, Claire added quickly. Dad would kill me, but I thought you should know. Before I could respond, the terrace doors burst open. Charles re-emerged with a boisterous laugh, and one arm slung around Russell's stiff shoulders. The future looks bright, doesn't it, Russell? Once the Aldridge merger finalizes next month, we'll dominate the eastern seaboard. Indeed, Russell replied, his smile taut and hollow. I noticed it didn't touch his eyes, the same eyes that had locked with mine earlier, cold and unreadable. More guests spilled onto the terrace as the fundraising program wrapped. Graham found me again, still wrapped in his privileged bubble, untouched by the chaos Juliette had nearly unleashed. Dad says we raised $8 million tonight, he beamed. Juliette's already talking about how to spin it into wedding PR. Of course she was. Juliette's upcoming wedding to Spencer Aldridge had nothing to do with love and everything to do with uniting two corporate empires. I nodded and smiled, playing the supportive wife, while quietly mapping the web of secrets and leverage that propped up this glittering world. At exactly 10 p.m., fireworks burst over the Hudson in glittering cascades. Faces tilted upward in awe. I'd already seen the light I needed, reflected in Juliette's smug backlit profile. 3 years of humiliation, of being tolerated, never accepted, of watching Juliette crush anyone in her path with the practiced cruelty of someone who'd never faced consequence. As the sky lit up, I made a silent vow. She would fall, not tomorrow, not next week. But when the moment was perfect, Russell's glinting stare, Claire's whispered warning, the hairline fractures running through the Whitmore empire. Juliette had no idea, but tonight, with one champagne toast and a single careless insult, she'd planted the seeds of her own destruction. I wore emerald green, I said lightly, knowing it would irritate Juliette, who specifically asked guests to wear pastels to complement her blush-toned gown. You look beautiful, Claire whispered when she found me near the champagne fountain, and exactly like someone who didn't read the dress code memo. I smiled innocently. Was there a memo? Claire's laugh drew a few glances. She looked luminous in a silver sheath that perfectly matched her prematurely gray hair, a trait inherited from Russell and worn with defiant elegance. Dad sends his regrets, she added in a low voice. Last-minute business in Tokyo. How convenient, I murmured. Her eyes danced with mischief. He did send a gift though, some antique Chinese vase. Obscenely valuable, hideous. Of course, but worth more than most people's homes. Across the room, Juliette held court like a monarch. Her left hand was positioned just so to catch the chandelier light, her ring at least 10 carats flashing like a lighthouse in stormy waters. Spencer Aldridge stood beside her, visibly uncomfortable in his tux, his gaze darting back to his phone again and again. They look thrilled, I murmured. Oh, they're ecstatic, Claire said dryly. About the stock options. Did you know the prenup took longer to negotiate than their entire relationship? The evening unfolded with expected excess, elaborate hors d'oeuvre, a string quartet playing something indistinctly baroque, and champagne poured as if the bubbles themselves held shares in the company. Charles clinked his glass for attention, his face flushed with triumph rather than affection. To new beginnings, he boomed, his gaze sweeping the room, not toward the couple but toward the board members, investors and future allies, and to the joining of two great families and the enterprises they lead. Polite applause followed. I scanned the room, some clapped out of genuine goodwill, most for optics. My eyes landed on Thomas Aldridge, Spencer's father. He stood apart from the crowd, beads of sweat forming on his brow despite the full blast of air conditioning. He stared down at his phone, scrolling urgently. When he noticed me watching, he stuffed it into his pocket and offered a strained smile. I excused myself from Claire and drifted toward the bar, positioning myself near enough to catch the sharp edge of his words to an associate. I don't care what we have to liquidate, just keep it quiet until after the merger announcement. I sipped my champagne slowly, letting the words sink in. The foundation wasn't just cracking, it was disintegrating. Later that night, as Graham and I drove home, His usual breezy confidence was nowhere to be found. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, white-knuckled in the dark. "Is everything okay?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He hesitated. "Just business stuff, nothing to worry about. I'm your wife, Graham. If something's wrong, tell me." He sighed. "It's this merge. If the Aldridge deal falls through," he trailed off, then continued reluctantly. "Dad's leveraged nearly everything on this. The wedding, the announcement, the expansion plans, everything. One domino falls, it all comes down." I placed a hand over his. "I'm sure it'll work out." "Of course it will," he said too quickly. "Juliette won't let it fail. She's planned this thing down to the last rose petal." I didn't mention the sweat pouring from Thomas Aldridge's temples or the desperation in his voice. Some observations were best kept close. 3 days later, Claire called me at midnight. I slipped out of bed, leaving Graham fast asleep, and padded into the office. "Evelyn," she said, breathless with restrained excitement. "Sorry it's late, but I thought you should know Dad's reached his breaking point with the Whitmore. He's liquidating all joint ventures tomorrow afternoon." My heart pounded. "Tomorrow? Are you sure?" "Positive. The paperwork's already signed. He's calling Charles at 2 p.m. to make it official." She paused. "It's going to be brutal. The market will react instantly. And the Aldridge merger, that's the thing," she whispered. "It's built entirely on our partnership. Once we pull out, the whole thing collapses." I leaned back in my chair, eyes closed, mapping the timing like a battlefield strategist. "The rehearsal dinner was tomorrow night, is it?" Claire said, feigning innocence poorly. "What unfortunate timing." After we hung up, I sat in the dark, the possibilities arranging themselves before me like chess pieces. Elegant and inevitable. 3 years of watching, waiting, enduring. Juliette's cruelty, Charles's arrogance. A house built not on vision, but manipulation. I unlocked my phone and scrolled to a number I rarely used. My finger hovered, then tapped. Russell answered on the second ring, his voice alert. "Evelyn, is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," I replied, my tone even and precise. "I hope I'm not calling too late." "Not at all," he said, already sensing the tone beneath mine. "What can I do for you?" I chose my words carefully. "Claire mentioned you're planning some significant business changes tomorrow." "She shouldn't have shared that," Russell said mildly, but I could hear the edge beneath his calm. "Probably not," I agreed, "but she did, and it got me thinking about timing." I traced a slow circle on my desk with one fingertip, my voice dropping to a near whisper. "What if you moved your timeline up to tonight?" The silence on the other end stretched, charged and heavy with recognition. "Tonight," Russell repeated slowly. "During the rehearsal dinner, you mean?" I didn't confirm. I didn't have to. Russell's low chuckle held no humor. Only the cool acknowledgement of a strategist recognizing another. "You've always seen more than people give you credit for, haven't you, Evelyn?" "I observe," I said simply. "And now I act. Justice delayed is justice denied. Isn't that what they say?" Another pause, longer this time. "Then I'll need to make some calls." "Of course. I wouldn't want to keep you." I moved to hang up when his voice stopped me. "Evelyn, why now? After all this time?" I thought of Juliette's smirk at the Lumiere ball, of 3 years of subtle humiliation, of condescension masked as civility, of being treated like an accessory in my own life. Let's just say, I believe in perfect timing. Then I ended the call. I sat in the dark, the quiet hum of anticipation buzzing beneath my skin like the low thrum before a storm. Tomorrow night, Juliette's perfect world would implode, and I would be there to watch every glorious second of it. The next evening, I arrived at the rehearsal dinner beside Graham, dressed in a midnight blue gown, elegant but understated. Nothing too flashy. Tonight wasn't about me. I was merely the observer, the invisible catalyst who'd already set the chain reaction in motion. The venue, a private rooftop restaurant, overlooking the Manhattan skyline, had been rented out in full for the occasion. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead as the city twinkled in the distance. Inside, the Whitmores, the Aldridges, and a carefully curated circle of elite investors mingled with wine and agendas. Juliette had, of course, arranged the seating herself. Every table was a power play. I found my place card tucked at the furthest corner of the room, between 2 of Charles's widowed cousins. "I'll have them fix it," Graham offered, clearly uncomfortable, but I gently rested my hand on his arm. "It's fine," I said. "I like it here." And my spot gave me the perfect vantage point to observe the disaster about to unfold. I glanced at my watch. 7:45 p.m. A text from Russell blinked on my screen. "Everything is in place." His team had executed the liquidation flawlessly. Over the last 18 hours, Sterling Capital had pulled out of every joint venture with Whitmore Holdings. The financial media had been prepped. The news would drop at exactly 8 p.m., just as Charles would raise his glass for his speech. The first course arrived. Scallops. Artfully plated. I barely touched them. All my focus was on the head table. Juliette, draped in a silver sheath dress that shimmered with every breath, sat like a queen holding court. Around her neck hung a diamond necklace. A gift from Spencer's PR team, though I suspected it had less to do with sentiment and more with optics. Spencer himself stood just behind her, uncomfortable in his designer tux, checking his phone for the third time in 2 minutes. At 5 minutes to 8, Charles rose to his feet, champagne glass in hand. The room fell quiet. Distinguished guests, beloved family members, he began, his voice carrying the polished timbre of someone who'd made a career out of commanding boardroom. We gather here tonight on the eve of a momentous occasion, not merely the union of two people, but the joining of two great legacies. He paused, letting the room absorb the gravity of his words. Investors straightened in their chairs. Socialites lifted their glasses photographers hovered for the right angle. I sipped my wine, heart steady. 8 o'clock was only seconds away, and Charles Whitmore Sr. was about to give the speech of his life. Right before it all fell apart, I took a small sip of wine, savoring the moment like the vintage itself, rich, sharp and aged to perfection. Tomorrow, Charles continued, raising his glass, when Juliette and Spencer exchange vows, they will be cementing more than their love. They will be forging the future, a future of prosperity, growth and... His phone buzzed loudly against the table. He frowned, glanced down. His face remained composed, but I caught the flicker, just the slightest tightening around his eyes. He silenced the screen and cleared his throat. As I was saying, a future of unprecedented opportunity for Buzz. Then again, and again, not just his phone now. The entire room, the once elegant hum of conversation, was replaced by the discordant chime of dozens of notifications, vibrating like a swarm of digital locusts. The orchestra faltered, musicians casting nervous glances toward the ripple of movement among the guests. Thomas Aldridge was the first to react. He checked his phone, paled instantly, the color draining from his face like a flipped switch. Beneath the chandelier light, he looked more ghost than mogul. Charles, he croaked, interrupting. The stock. He didn't finish. Charles's own ringtone blared, one he reserved for urgent business. The moment it rang, the last vestiges of calm evaporated from the room. With a forced smile, he set down his glass. One moment, please. I'm sure it's... But it wasn't nothing. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass that separated the private dining room from the hallway, we could all see it happen, his face shifting in real time from confusion to horror to volcanic rage. It was like watching a monument fracture. Deliberate, crushing, inevitable. He returned seconds later, face twisted, voice no longer polished but ragged with disbelief. What do you mean he's withdrawn? He bellowed, the words slicing through the music and the murmurs. His champagne glass hit the floor, shattering into crystal shrapnel. That's impossible. The paperwork wasn't final until next week. The room froze. Juliette clutched her diamond necklace as if it were a lifeline. Father, she whispered. Her voice held something I had never heard from her before. Pure, unfiltered, fear. But Charles didn't answer. He was already shouting into his phone, spit flying. Call him back. Tell Sterling he can't do this. The announcement is Monday. The name Sterling echoed across the room like a detonation. Gasps. Phones raised. Panic blooming in every corner like a fast-spreading virus. Whitmore Holdings plummets 43% in after-hours trading. Someone read aloud, trembling. Sterling Capital severs all ties with Whitmore, added another voice. Aldridge Maritime expected to withdraw from merger talks. Thomas Aldridge swayed. His face went from pale to ashen to gray-green. He reached for the table, missed, collapsed face first into his untouched chocolate soufflé. The chaos that followed was exquisite. Waiters rushed to Mr. Aldridge's aid. Business associates huddled in corners, phones pressed to ears, frantically barking into the storm. The string quartet fumbled through a transition into something somber, as if a funeral march might soften the financial carnage. And through it all, Juliette stood utterly still, like a statue. Only her eyes moved, blinking in slow realization. This wasn't just a hiccup. This was the end of everything. The wedding, she whispered. Then louder, shrill, panicked. The wedding. What about the wedding? Spencer had his back to her, already mid-call, barking instructions to his financial team. His priorities were clear. Juliette's mask cracked. She lunged at Graham, who stood frozen beside me. Do something, she shrieked, nails digging into his arm. Call your contacts. Call some. This can't be happening. Graham looked from his sister to his father, now slumped in a chair, still begging someone on the phone to find a way. His voice was ragged. "I don't think there's anything we can do," Graham murmured. "If Sterling's out, I don't care what he's done." Juliette screamed. Her voice reached a pitch so sharp it practically fractured the chandeliers. "Fix it." I remained in my seat, perfectly still, lifting my wineglass in quiet salute. Across the chaos, our eyes met, hers wide, wild, desperate. Mine, steady, satisfied. For the briefest moment, a flash of suspicion crossed her face, then it was gone, overtaken by raw panic as Thomas Aldridge regained consciousness, only to immediately start calling his broker. By midnight, the restaurant was nearly empty. The Aldridges had fled en masse, Spencer among them, without so much as a glance back at his fiancée. The investors had evaporated. What remained was the Whitmore family, shattered and stunned. Graham and I rode back to the Whitmore estate in silence, seated opposite Charles and Juliette in the back of the car. No one spoke. The mansion, still draped in white flowers and silk ribbons for the next day's garden ceremony, felt like a mausoleum. Juliette vanished upstairs. Charles locked himself in his study with a bottle of 20-year-old scotch. The next morning, as dawn broke over a city already buzzing with headlines, the announcement was made official. The wedding was cancelled. I found Juliette later that day alone in her room. She was surrounded by unopened wedding gifts, still wrapped, still labeled in delicate calligraphy. Her gown hung from the closet door, ivory and perfect, now absurd in its hopefulness. She wasn't wearing makeup. Her hair was tangled, her eyes rimmed in red. But I knew, just as certainly as I knew the sun would rise, that she wasn't crying for love. She was crying for her empire, for the power she'd lost, for the future that had dissolved in a single exquisite evening. "Are you happy now?" Juliette whispered hoarsely. I leaned casually against the doorframe. "Why would I be happy that your wedding was cancelled?" Her laugh was hollow, brittle. "Don't pretend. I saw your face last night. You enjoyed every second." I didn't deny it. Some truths don't need to be spoken to be perfectly understood. There was nothing left to say. We both knew what had happened, even if she didn't understand how precisely I'd orchestrated it. I left her room in silence. In the hallway I nearly collided with Graham. He looked as though he hadn't slept in days. "Dad's in his study," he muttered, voice raw. "He's been on the phone with Russell Sterling all night." I nodded, feigning concern. "Any progress?" He raked a hand through his tousled hair, more out of exhaustion than frustration. "None. Sterling won't budge. Dad's offered him everything. Board seats, increased shares, even naming rights on the new headquarters. And he just keeps referring to some formal letter his legal team sent. Effective immediately. All ties are severed. No negotiation. No transition period. Just." From downstairs came the sharp crash of something valuable shattering. Charles's temper finally breaking against the antique walls of his family legacy. I winced, partially out of reflex, partially for the Whitmore estate was full of priceless art and heirlooms collected over generations. Each tantrum came at a steep cost. Graham glanced at his phone. The stock's still falling, down 6.2% now. The business press is calling it Black Friday, even though it's Tuesday. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot, dark circled. "We're ruined, Evelyn." I placed a steadying hand on his arm. "Not ruined. Changed." "I don't think you understand," he said, hollow. "The house, the vacation properties, even our personal account, it's all tied to company assets. Dad leveraged everything into the Aldridge merger." "Everything?" I asked. And this time my surprise wasn't entirely feigned. I'd planned for damage, yes, but not full annihilation. Graham nodded grimly. "The prenup negotiations took forever, because Dad was hiding how little liquidity we actually had. The Aldridges wanted guarantees we couldn't make without the merger." Another crash rang out below. A third vase maybe. Or a sculpture. We both flinched and glanced toward the stairwell, then back at each other. "You should get some rest," I said gently. "Tomorrow's going to be difficult enough." Graham laughed, quiet and bitter. Tomorrow we start selling assets to pay credit. Tomorrow the board meets to discuss whether Dad steps down. Tomorrow our legal team meets with the SEC to address insider trading allegations that someone mysteriously filed. I kept my expression neutral. The SEC complaint had been Claire's idea. A brilliant one I hadn't even needed to suggest. As he turned to go, Graham paused. He studied me, his gaze unexpectedly sharp. "You knew this would happen. It wasn't a question. In that moment, I saw it clearly. Graham might have been raised inside the Whitmore cocoon, but he wasn't blind. Not complete. Not exactly, I replied carefully. Not the scale of it. But you knew something, he said, stepping closer. When Dad announced the merger, you didn't even blink. When it collapsed, you were ready. I met his gaze evenly, neither confirming nor denying. After a long pause, something flickered across his face. Not betrayal, not anger. Respect. Remind me never to underestimate you, he said quietly. Then he turned and disappeared down the hall toward his childhood bedroom. The next week unfolded like a slow-motion avalanche, inescapable and impossible to look away from. Every headline bled disaster. The press dubbed it the Whitmore wreckage. Lawsuits from investors. Emergency meetings. Charles forced to resign. Even the family jet was seized by creditors mid-flight and impounded in Zurich, forcing them to return to New York commercial in coach. But the most fascinating collapse was Juliette's. Her social death was absolute. Friends who'd fought to be bridesmaids suddenly ghosted her. Gala invitations disappeared. Her social media accounts, once overflowing with fawning praise, became silent wastelands. 10 days after the dinner, I accompanied Graham to their family lawyer's office. The mahogany-paneled conference room felt more like a wake than a strategy session. The Manhattan penthouse must be sold immediately, the lawyer said, sliding a stack of documents across the table, as well as the Hamptons estate and the vineyard property in Napa. Charles, now reduced to a rumpled man in an off-the-rack blazer, simply not. Juliette, however, wasn't surrendering so easily. What about my personal assets? She snapped. My jewelry collection is insured for $8 million. The attorney cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. I'm afraid most of your collection was acquired through company funds or purchased via corporate accounts. She blinked. That's impossible. The documentation is quite clear, he replied gently. The items are now inventoried for liquidation. Juliette's mouth fell open, but no words came. The diamond tiara, the emerald cuff, the necklace she wore to the Lumiere ball. All gone. All repurposed. Assets, not heirlooms. I said nothing, but inwardly I couldn't help but appreciate the irony. The emblems of her power, the jewels she flaunted, the symbols of her control, were now being auctioned off piece by piece to pay for the empire she helped destroy. And I hadn't even raised my voice. That's impossible, Juliette snapped, slamming her palm against the polished table. My diamond parure was a gift from my father. A gift purchased through the company, the lawyer replied gently, and written off as a corporate marketing expense. The documentation is quite clear. When we left the meeting, Juliette was still arguing, her voice rising to a pitch sharp enough to make the receptionist visibly flinch. Graham and I stepped into the elevator in silence. Will you stay? He asked suddenly as the doors slid shut. With me, I now that. His voice trailed off as he gestured vaguely at the wreckage of his world. I took his hand. Do you think I married you for your money? I wouldn't blame you if you had, he said softly. It's what everyone else wanted from us. I'm not everyone. The truth, as it often is, was more complicated. I hadn't married Graham for love. Not at first. I married him because he was kind when his family was cruel. Because he saw me when they didn't even bother to look. Love came later, slowly, quietly. But watching him now, dignified, resilient, stripped of privilege yet somehow more grounded, I realized something had changed in me too. What had grown between us was no longer about circumstance. It was. 2 days later, Claire invited me to lunch at a discreet bistro tucked into a quiet street far from the chaos of the financial district. To the architect of the most elegant revenge I've ever witnessed, she said, raising her water glass. I never thought you had it in you. I offered a faint smile. I had excellent help. Your father provided the opportunity. I recognized the moment. From her handbag she pulled a small velvet pouch and set it on the table. I brought you some. Inside lay a luminous strand of South Sea pearls. Impossibly perfect. Instantly recognizable. Juliette had worn them to my wedding, making sure to loudly comment on their value compared to my modest diamond pendant. How did you? They were part of the asset seizure, Claire said, her smile wicked. Dad's company acquired them in the liquidation. He thought you might appreciate them. A trophy for the real winner, I murmured. We shared a conspiratorial laugh, though mine was quieter. Revenge, I was learning, doesn't always satisfy. It doesn't erase years of being undermined, ignored, humiliated. It doesn't heal. It only balances the scales. That weekend, I visited the Whitmore estate for the last time. Movers bustled through rooms, wrapping oil paintings and boxing heirlooms for auction. The house smelled of lemon polish and quiet endings. Juliette was nowhere to be seen. Rumor had it she'd accepted an offer to stay in a cousin's guest house in Connecticut, until she re-established herself. A euphemism if I'd ever heard one. In the master suite, the safe stood open, empty but for a few pieces deemed Charles's personal property. I recognized several as items he'd given Juliette over the years, gifts she'd flaunted with performative elegance. With the movers distracted downstairs, I gathered what remained: a diamond tennis bracelet, a pair of sapphire drop earrings, an emerald pendant. I slipped them into my purse, not to keep, but for a final purpose. That evening, I made an anonymous donation to the Beacon Hope Foundation, the children's cancer charity that had hosted the gala where all of this began. I specified in my note that the jewelry be auctioned at their next fundraiser. The irony was deliberate and delicious. Juliette's status symbols, once paraded for influence, would now fund a cause she had only used as a social backdrop. As I stepped out of the courier's office, I felt something release inside me. A weight lifted. The Whitmore empire had collapsed, but from its ashes something more honest might grow. For Charles, maybe humility; for Juliette, perhaps self-awareness; for Graham, freedom from expectations, from entitlement, from legacy; and for me, a quiet triumph. Not loud, not gloating, just closure. The scales had balanced. Justice, cold and precise, had been served. 3 weeks later, Graham and I moved into a modest brownstone in Park Slope. It was a far cry from the penthouse we'd once called home. The floors were scuffed, the kitchen was outdated, the radiators clanked at night, but sunlight poured through tall windows, warming the hardwood like a promise. "It's small," Graham said, sounding apologetic as we carried in our first boxes. "It's ours," I corrected him. "Really ours. We were building something from scratch, with no shadows hanging over." He had accepted a teaching position at Hudson College, a step down in title and pay, but his eyes had lit up when he talked about it. He wanted to teach business ethics of all things. Imagine that. A month later, Charles asked to visit. He looked like a different man when he arrived. No designer suit, no Rolex, just khakis, a wrinkled button-down and a quiet humility. "Nice place," he said, glancing around our living room. No snide remark, no subtle dig, just a simple observation. Graham had been called to campus for a last-minute faculty meeting, so it was just the two of us, seated across from one another at the kitchen table over a pot of fresh coffee. The silence between us stretched, until finally he cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology, Evelyn." I raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "When Graham first brought you home," he began, "I saw you as beneath us," I supplied calmly. He nodded. "I was wrong." A pause. "You were the only one who saw us clearly, who saw Juliette clearly." His mention of his daughter sent a pang through me, something not quite guilt, but near enough to sting. I had orchestrated their downfall without remorse. Every step had been calculated, clean and deserved. But sitting across from this quieter, older version of Charles Whitmore, stripped of polish and posturing, I couldn't help but wonder about the human cost. "How is she?" I asked. Charles looked down into his coffee cup as though searching for an answer in the steam. "She hasn't adjusted well," he admitted. "Not to reduced circumstances. I imagine not. Her cousin Cameron offered her a position at that finishing school he runs in Switzerland." His dry chuckle lacked any mirth. "Juliette, teaching etiquette. The irony isn't lost on me. At 28, Juliette had essentially been exiled under the guise of opportunity, boarding school for adults in designer exile. I indulged her too much," Charles continued quietly. "After her mother died, I thought giving her everything she wanted might make up for what she'd lost." "You could have offered comfort," I said gently, "but sometimes the most important lessons need to hurt." "Yes," he agreed after a pause. "They do." We finished our coffee in silence. When he left, his posture was somehow straighter, like the weight of decades of denial had finally lifted. That night, Graham came home late, smelling of chalk dust and cheap campus coffee. I was already in bed reading by lamplight when he sat beside me, took the book from my hands and set it aside. "Dad told me about your conversation," he said. "Did he?" He nodded. "He also told me something interesting. Apparently Russell Sterling approached him 2 years ago about dissolving their partnership quietly." I raised an eyebrow. "That sounds like Sterling." "Dad refused," Graham continued, watching me closely. "Tried to leverage the partnership for more control." "So sounds like your father. But here's the thing," Graham said, his tone softening. Russell specifically mentioned concerns about how Juliette treated you. Said it reminded him of how his late wife was treated by her in-law. My heart beat faster, though I kept my expression calm. That's interesting. Dad thought it was just a negotiation tactic at the time. Graham reached out, gently tracing my cheekbone, but now he wonders. Maybe Sterling was waiting for the right moment or the right person to give him a reason. His eyes searched mine, steady and unnervingly perceptive. You didn't just make a phone call that night, did you? I didn't answer immediately, because the truth was complicated. I hadn't planned it all from the beginning. But I had been watching, listening, collecting, waiting. Does it matter now? I asked softly. No, Graham said after a long moment. Except that I'm realizing, I never really knew you. His smile was weary, a little odd. You're terrifying, and I love you for it. He kissed me then. Something shifted between us, something old finally falling away. What remained was real. Tested, forged in fire and forged to last. The next morning, a small package arrived by courier. Inside was a vintage fountain pen in a leather case, and a handwritten note on heavy cream-colored stationery. Evelyn, this pen belonged to my father, who built our company from nothing. He taught me that true power comes not from wealth or status, but from patience and precision. You remind me of him. R.S. Your father would be proud. Coming from Russell Sterling, a man who offered praise only when it mattered. The note felt like a coronation. My father, a professor of ethics, had died long before I met Graham. He would have disapproved of my method, but he would have understood the purpose behind them. The justice at their core. I turned the pen slowly in my hands. It felt earned. Then my phone rang. Claire, still on for lunch tomorrow? She asked, no preamble. Of course. The usual place. Perfect. A pause. I heard Juliette's off to Switzerland. She added dryly. Teaching at a finishing school. Of all things. So I've heard. Claire laughed. I'd pay money to see that. Can you imagine her correcting someone's posture while she's mentally critiquing their handbag? We chatted briefly. Damon's health. Excellent. Her new executive responsibilities exhausting but rewarding, and Graham's surprising talent in academia. Students loved him. Just as we were about to hang up, her voice shifted. Evelyn, one thing. Yes, what you did, it was justified, necessary even. A beat. But be careful. Of what? Of becoming what you hated. The warning was gentle, but it landed. Revenge reshapes you, she said. If you're not careful. After we ended the call, I opened the small velvet box I kept tucked away in my dresser. Inside were the diamond earrings I'd taken from Juliette's collection. Not to wear, not to sell, just to remember. I turned them under the light, letting the facets cast reflections against the wall. They weren't trophies, they were reminders. That the line between justice and cruelty is razor thin. That a scalpel in the wrong hands becomes a weapon. That precision can heal, but also destroy. I closed the box, didn't discard it. Some reminders are necessary, not of victory, but of the vigilance required not to become the very thing you fought against. 6 months passed. Winter melted into spring. The potted plants on our Brooklyn balcony bloomed again, unexpectedly full of life. The city seemed brighter somehow. Or maybe it was just that I was seeing it without the shadow of the Whitmore's legacy, coloring every corner. Graham thrived in academia. His students adored him. He wasn't the heir anymore. He was the professor. Sometimes I passed by his classroom watching him animate business ethics with chalk-streaked sleeves, and an open heart. Watching students lean forward, actually listen. One evening, as we walked home from dinner at a cozy neighborhood bistro, he squeezed my hand and said, I had lunch with Russell today. I raised an eyebrow. Oh? He's interested in backing a new venture. I stopped walking. With us. Graham smiled. With us. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying, starting our own firm, independent of the Whitmore legacy, but with Sterling's strategic support. A week later we met Russell in his penthouse office. Glass steel and silence high above the city. Below us Manhattan shimmered like a constellation of second chances. The landscape has changed, Russell said, unrolling a sleek folder of documents across his desk. There's a void where Whitmore Holdings used to stand, and that void isn't begging for expansion, it's begging for ethics. You think we can fill it? I asked. Russell's smile was shrewd, restrained. I think you already wrote the blueprint for it. He wasn't wrong. During my years quietly watching the Whitmore empire, I had mentally catalogued every flaw, every corner cut, every over-leveraged alliance, every policy that treated loyalty as liability and employees as temporary scaffold. In the back of my mind, I'd been sketching another kind of company, one built on transparency, resilience, human dignity. We'd have to start small, Graham said cautiously. Small, I agreed, but significant. Ideas were already forming: sustainable investment, transparent governance, partnerships based on trust instead of intimidation, something that couldn't be toppled by a single bad merger, or the tantrum of one man with a fragile ego. Russell leaned back in his chair, amusement flickering in his eyes. I knew you two would find your footing. When can you start? And just like that, Harbor & Co. was born, named for the quiet stability we intended to offer, for the safe place we never had, now building for others. We leased a modest space in a converted industrial building in Dumb. The walls were exposed brick, the desks were mismatched, and the light was perfect. We hired a small team of analysts and advisors, who believed what we believed, that innovation meant more than speed, and leadership meant more than control. While we grew our roots across town, another phoenix was quietly stirring from the Whitmore wreckage. Charles, humbled but not defeated, had launched a one-man consultancy from a converted guest house on his brother's property in upstate New York. His client list was short, but growing: boutique firms, small businesses, startups with integrity, the kind of work he never would have considered in his former life. He's different, Graham told me after a visit. Still driven, but the sharp edges, they're gone. He's actually listening now. I nodded. I'd seen the change myself, over a dinner where Charles, once allergic to taking advice, had sincerely asked my opinion on a client proposal. He was no longer feared, but he was finally earning respect. 8 months into Harbor & Co., an envelope arrived at our office. Swiss postmark. No return address, no message inside, just a photograph. A single still frame from the Lumiere ball. Juliette, mid-toast, champagne glass raised, smile frozen in time, the precise moment before her words detonated years of carefully preserved alliances. I recognized her handwriting on the envelope instantly. From Juliette, Graham asked, entering the room as I stood motionless with the photo in my hands. I nodded. No message? He looked at the image, then at me. What do you think it means? I traced the corner of the glossy card with my thumb. Recognition, maybe understanding. It's the moment everything started. Her downfall, and mine. He raised an eyebrow. Not downfall, I corrected. Descent, maybe, into who I had to become briefly to balance the scale. I framed the photo and placed it on my desk, not as a trophy, but as a compass. A reminder that even small actions ripple outward, and every ripple eventually returns to its source. Nearly a year after the collapse, Claire invited us to dinner, an exclusive rooftop restaurant in Tribeca, strung with lights like falling stars. She arrived radiant in an ivory pantsuit that managed to convey both command and warmth. Her gray hair was swept into a soft chignon, elegance without pretense. To the new CEO of Sterling Enterprises, Graham said, raising his glass. Claire's smile was brilliant. Dad's not fully retiring, of course. He'll stay on as chairman, but day to day, it's mine now. It had been a meteoric rise, at least from the outside, but anyone who knew Claire knew better. This was no handout. Russell hadn't given her the company. He'd prepared her to earn it. Every late night, every strategy memo, every decision questioned harder than her male peers faced. It had led to this, and no one was more ready. Your idea for integrating Harbor & Co. as our strategic development arm is brilliant, Claire told me over dessert. The board approved it unanimously. The partnership would expand Sterling Enterprises' reach exponentially while allowing us to maintain our independence. It was the perfect equilibrium: growth with autonomy, scale with integrity. As we discussed the finer points of the plan, I found myself marveling at how effortlessly Claire carried her new authority. She had always been gracious, but now that grace was girded by a power forged through work, grit and clarity of purpose, the kind usually reserved for those who'd long sacrificed kindness to climb. But not Claire. Oh, by the way, she added casually as we prepared to leave, slipping her clutch under her arm. I'm getting married. The announcement was so breezy I almost missed it. To whom? I asked, surprised. James Porter, she said, and to my astonishment she actually blushed. He teaches literature at Hudson College. We met at a fundraiser last fall. Not a merger, not a chess piece. Just love. Simple, honest, unencumbered by any underlying strategic motive. The wedding was planned for early summer, intimate and unpretentious despite Claire's position and fortune. No corporate sponsorships disguised as centerpieces. No backroom deals over canapés. Just vows, music and people who matter. On a sunlit June afternoon, we gathered in the sculpture garden of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The air smelled like lilacs and new beginnings. Claire walked down the aisle on her father's arm, radiant in a sleek ivory sheath. Russell, older now and finally allowing himself to look it, beamed with unfiltered pride. "Never thought I'd see the day," he murmured as we stood beside the reception bar. "A sterling marrying for love, instead of leverage." Thanks in no small part to you," he added, lifting his glass slightly. As the evening unfolded, I found myself near the fountain with Claire, both of us momentarily removed from the celebration. "Remember when we met?" she asked, eyes soft. "At that dreadful Christmas party." I laughed. "Where Juliette? Sorry, your sister-in-law spilled red wine on my white dress. And I showed up with club soda and a knowing look," she finished. I nodded. I knew then we spoke the same language. "A kindred spirit," she said. "Someone who saw through the facade but still played the game at least long enough to rewrite it." We looked out over the guests' genuine smiles, real conversations, laughter untouched by performance. There was Graham, deep in conversation with James, about some obscure literary theory, his face lit up with curiosity. Across the lawn, Daniel, one of our junior analysts, was showing photos of his community garden project to a retired judge who had taken an interest. And Russell stood off to the side, hands behind his back, simply watching his daughter with quiet satisfaction. "Look where it got us," Claire whispered. I squeezed her hand. "Karma doesn't forget addresses," I said, echoing something my father once told me. "Neither do friends," she replied, eyes glinting. Just then the orchestra struck up a waltz, warm and swelling, filling the garden with something like magic. Graham appeared at my side, extending his hand with a familiar smile. I stepped into his arms, and we began to move. No steps rehearsed, no plan choreographed, just instinct, rhythm and shared memory. We danced across the grass as twilight settled over the museum, the soft clink of glasses and murmurs of joy blurring into background music. The past was behind us, every betrayal, every lie, every silent dinner and hollow celebration. What stretched before us was something new, a future made not from inheritance, but from intention, a life of our own design, unfolding like moonlight on still water, soft, steady, and completely ours. If you enjoyed this story of calculated revenge, power shifts and poetic justice, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more tales where karma hits harder than any plot twist. Every view, like and comment helps support the channel and keeps these stories coming. Now I want to hear from you. If you were in Evelyn's shoes, would you have waited 3 years like she did? Or struck back sooner? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. Let's talk about the fine line between justice and revenge.